And we're back. We're going to talk about the client architecture of Galaxy, so the architecture of Galaxy's um, web user interface. Um, let's talk about a few client directories first. So the style sheets and the JavaScript that make up the client are in client Galaxy's style and scripts respectively. What's there is a source, and in order to build that source, um, the the clients need to be transpiled or packed into bundles that will be served from static dist. And so when you call run.sh, this packing process happens and builds the client. So it uses getdiff to try to determine if the client needs to be built before starting Galaxy. And then Webpack is used to build these compiled artifacts. The upshot is if you develop against the client, if you modify files in client, you need to rebuild with make client before deployment. There's some targets, makefile targets to sort of help you with the client, or you can go into the client directory and use yarn directly. Um, the sort of base of all of this is Node.js dependencies target in the makefile. It will install Node.js and the dependencies you need to sort of run the client. This make client builds the client-side artifacts for like local development purposes. If you're running it on a production system, I recommend to make production maps. And so this will build a more optimized version of the client along with source maps. If you're doing a lot of development, probably want to do client watch. This will like sort of monitor the client for changes and rebuild incrementally as needed. Before you commit your code and open a pull request with client changes, it's good to run make client format. This will run prettier under the hood and format up the client code to our standards. So this makes like non-functional transformations, but it cleans up the code style. There's a couple more useful development targets in there. ESLint will run the linting of the code, and then make client test will run the JavaScript test, the unit test via Karma. We mentioned Webpack. I'm no Webpack expert, but my understanding is that you can have a lot of different kinds of files. We have JS files. We have well, SC, SS, and a couple less files, and then certain kinds of images and stuff. And what Webpack can do is it takes all of those and it bundles it down into just a couple static assets, so that instead of needing to fetch hundreds of files from the client, you can just fetch a couple artifacts or assets. And while it's doing that sort of transpilation, it also optimizes the code. It it converts the high level ES6 that we use down to like native browser JavaScript for the browsers that we target. So a lot of goodness is happening in here, and it's sort of the workhorse of the client packaging. Yeah, so that's basically what I said. Transpiles the ES code, the Vue modules, the libraries from npm, and our style sheets into browser native bundles. There's lots of active development and complexity around all of the client build process, but Viz plugins in particular and their dependencies, for instance. But you can check out the Webpack configuration file in config webpack.config.js. It's fairly straightforward to read and understand what's going on. So if this code or if this blurb I'm talking about right now becomes dated, hopefully that file remains pretty readable, and you can sort of see how we are building visualization plugins, for instance, or what kinds of Webpack plugins we're running and using currently. So just like rendering this page, is using dozens, if not hundreds, of JavaScript files, and they're all just coming down as libs bundle and analysis bundled. So basically, the rest of these files I think are coming from the home screen here. This is usegalaxy.org. But for the app itself, they're this is a very optimized process to get it down to just the libraries Galaxy needs and the analysis bundle, or whatever bundle you're on. Right now, you sort of land on the analysis bundle. This is a kind of an old slide, but I think more or less still this is the case. And if anything, our web packing has gotten even more optimized since then. Style sheets. Hopefully you know what a style sheet is. It's the decoration for the colors and fonts and layout of a website. And rather than using CSS directly, galaxies are generally just defined using the SCSS syntax. So it's a high-level superset of CSS, and you can find the syntax here. Sass is leveraged by Webpack to convert these style sheets into native CSS and client at build time. You can rebuild just the styles with Makestyle, though. Galaxy CSS files can be found in client Galaxy style SCSS. So we've talked about Webpack config, and we've talked about the style sheets. But there's some other important client files. Package.json is the top-level node project, so it includes all the Yarn targets, so all the plugins we support for development and deployment. Usually there's a target in there for running that. And then it has a definition of the dependencies for the project. And so if you're sort of adding client dependencies, updating them, package.json will be a frequently used file, something good to look at and understand. Our mentioned prettier and our sort of code formatting for the client. Its configuration is in client also. Karma contains configurations for running the unit tests. So we've got Mocha and QUnit tests and a test suite that just runs all the tests that are bundled with the code. And so those are under client. Underneath client Galaxy, there's a docs directory which contains a Boost style guidist entry point. We're trying to make more use of this. I don't know if we're doing such a great job keeping it up, but it's a showcase for the components that you could call Galaxy components. So ideally, we would have everything in there from like forms to history panels to pages and like all of the Galaxy objects and all of the lower level browser functionality that sort of combine into those styles would all have component galleries that you could sort of browse and sort of see, it serve as documentation for what a Galaxy style looks like. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's an aspirational thing. Images are the image assets that ship with Galaxy. We talked about the styles. And then Galaxy Client Scripts is the client source code. There's a ton of stuff in here. I was sort of thinking about the client today, and I realized that I believe we're on the 4th rewrite. So initially, Galaxy was, and I say originally, I've only been on the project for, maybe 8 years at the most, involved with it in some way. And I think, so there's a Perl project that predates that I know nothing about. But let's sort of say in that sort of modern era, originally it was Python with Mako, right? So we would render HTML directly from Python. And then there was the era of jQuery. You can see a lot of this still in the client scripts UI. I shouldn't say a lot, but there's still remnants of this. And so this is back in a time when, we weren't using a web framework really, but we were using a lot of jQuery. I should say they were using a lot of jQuery to sort of build up the web app. And so there's still remnants of that in there. After that era we went to sort of the backbone era. I guess this is when I joined the project. And so there's a ton of components in Client Galaxy Scripts MVC that are backbone-based views and models. I tried to hack together some MVC code. There is some of my code in there, but it was a real challenge. There was a lot of like connecting components. Making components connect and talk to each other and send events to each other was much more challenging than with reactive things. I'm not really a client-side developer, but I really love Vue.js. It's just the entire concept of the reactive web interface. It seems to live up to its promise, at least in my hands. I just feel like this is way more composable than what it came before, and ways sort of conceptually easier to think about. And so these new Vue.js components are in components. So this is going to have the newest code. Not promising everything in here is best practice, because even that is rapidly changing, but I think everything in here is a lot easier to understand than the things in MVC, and I think easier to sort of develop against. So frequently, if I'm developing something and it touches MVC, my very first development task is going to be rewriting it for Vue. So hopefully, by the time you're listening to this, MVC is smaller than ever, but that is a frequent development task. So sort of besides the sort of layers of frameworks, there's some other things in Client Galaxy scripts. The entry points for the Webpack bundles are underneath entry. There's more than just these three, but the three big ones are analysis, admin, and login. So if you land on the login page, like registration login, you'll hit this entry point. If you go into the admin page, you hit this entry point, and most of the rest of the app is analysis currently. OnLoad is a front-end initialization framework. So there's a bunch of things that Galaxy does when you land on the page, and they're all sort of registered as plugins in this OnLoad framework. We're using more and more Vuex all the time. There's some good and bad aspects of Vuex, but the definitions can be found in store. And so this is stuff, I probably should have a Vuex slide in here, but I don't currently. But this is for sort of state management at a global level across the app. Maybe you can kind of think of it as an event bus with global state. I'm sure that if you're a Vuex expert, that's a terrible way to describe it, but that's one way to think about it, I guess. Bundled entries. So these are like the globals that are hacked onto the global JavaScript window object. And so we have all sorts of, from these eras, we have all sorts of pieces of code, sitting in Mako files or sitting in plugins that are assuming certain things are available on the Galaxy window object. And so those things are hacked together in bundled entries. In polyfill, if you're not familiar with polyfilling is, my understanding is it's sort of specifying a minimum standard for what should be available in the runtime environment and making sure that it's there if it's not. Yeah, and so those are some of the important source files. Let's take a look at some components. So I've talked a lot about Vue.js, but I haven't really said what it is. So Vue.js components have three parts. I mean, generally at least two, but sometimes three. They have a template, a script, and then optionally has a style. This is in Client Scripts Galaxy Components Rule Builder. It's rule display. It's a little component. So the logic is down in script, but the template sort of lays out the component, how the component looks in the DOM, the document object model. So it's a list element. This one is serving as a list element. It's got some buttons here. It's got a title, and so you can see here this is sort of saying look for a sort of a title on my component and render it. And the computed, the component script definition is like an object essentially. The object has input properties and then different kinds of like computed properties and methods and like dynamic data. This doesn't have data, but it does have some computed properties, including title here. So that's how you put the title like inside of a tag. To use it as an attribute, if you want to bind this title attribute on the span tag here to edit title below. You use that syntax. These are sort of action handlers. So when this button is clicked, this method is called edit or remove for this button. And those are just in the methods. And what they're going to do is emit an edit and remove message back to the parent component. And so you can also sort of, one of the inputs here is a type object. It's a sort of complex JSON object called a rule. And you can access, different parts of rule here, rule.error, rule.warn. Yeah, and I think probably more rule.type is used inside of the computed attributes. So hopefully hopefully this templating is pretty straightforward. It's a lot easier to use than the previous Backbone views, in my opinion. And this defines a component, and so it's displaying one of the little rules in a list. So it's like, several different tags that sort of bundle together to just sort of act as one tag. And so we're looping over, a set of rules, and for each of them we're going to do a rule display. We're going to sort of add the rule. We're going to bind the rule, so we're saying that rule input is here. And the other input was called column headers, and so those are here. And the rest of this is like looping syntax, and this is responding to that edit and remove event that we saw before. So it's really, I find it really easy to stitch together components. I'm pretty happy with Vue.js, and I'm not one to be happy about frameworks generally. While I'm in here, this is one of the sort of first components that I initially built using an older form of Vue that Assunta rewrote for me using the correct modern syntax. I wanted to show maybe like a more complicated component. Here is the workflow run. So this is the run page when you go to call a run form, or when you click to run a workflow. And most of the complexity in that is going to be tool form stuff. And so most of that is being handled here as another component, the workflow run form. But I did sort of wanted to show you the conditional rendering here. If there's an error, then I'm going to display the error. If the page is still loading, we've got this loading span component. So this is showing subcomponents. We sort of define that tag here, and then the subcomponents that we used are defined in this script. So that's there. We use this loading stuff and all over the place. I think I wanted to show off this component because there's the view piece here, but then there's also a test case. Where I wanted to show off, there's the service and model layer. Okay, yeah, now I remember why I wanted this example. So this is, in order to render the workflow run form, we make an API request to sort of build up a description of the workflow and how to run it. And to do that, we've got a service object, and so we have these services or service.js files all over the components, and they're abstracting away the AJAX calls, the JSON calls against the API. And so this one, in particular, we've got, invoking a workflow and getting the run data that is used to generate the workflow. And to do that, we use Axios here, and we just make a request called get app root. So if Galaxy's served on a prefix or something, all of that logic is sort of defined during when we load the form. We take in a workflow ID, we use that in the URL request. We use axios.get. It's an asynchronous function, so we're going to wait for the response and then return the data in there. And then we build a model object, which is just a plain JavaScript object. A lot simpler than a Backbone model. We use this index so that we give the whole run package here. I don't know what the JavaScript terminology would be, but we get this whole run directory a consistent interface. So we sort of import that workflow run form and then export it as the default thing that this whole run package is, exporting. But then some of this other stuff, invoke workflow is dataset step is used in other parts of the app, and so they are annotated here and exported from here. So we're making very clear here what the interface is. I wish we did more of this kind of stuff on the back end. It's wonderful. I want to show you the test case. Here's how you load some JSON. Just got a sample request here with some JSON. And we're sort of mocking out. We mock out the Git app root, and we use the mock adapter here for Axios. So we're basically we're mocking out what's needed to get our Axios house in order for the test case. And so we're saying here on get, we're expecting this request, and we're going to reply with that sample data we loaded. And we do that before each test in this file, and afterwards we restore Axios. But we expect the Vue.js wrapper to have certain properties, and then we are sort of waiting. This await flush promises sort of says, wait for the API calls and wait for Vue to respond to them. Then we expect to have a model. We expect it to have some properties, etc. So that is, a really quick overview of Vue.js. There's lots of, I just picked a couple, but there's a lot of good examples. Probably these are like some of my favorite examples of my code. I'm sure there's, much more skilled client developers on the project than me, so I frequently look at their work also. So check it out. Yeah, and that's the client Vue.js architecture. Webhooks are another thing contributed to the Galaxy project by the Freiberg team. You can use them to write sort of small JS and or Python functions to sort of change some predefined behavior in certain parts of the Galaxy client. It's a plugin infrastructure for the UI. There's a whole training. And just a couple quick screenshots of examples. This one adds a show username button to the menu. This one overwrites or makes a modification to the workflow run, or not the workflow, the tool run page, so that it prints a little comic using the PHP Comics API, I guess, when the job is submitted. Another entry point is for the webhooks is the menu. Yeah. That is the client API as I know it. Thanks.